Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is the distinguished professor of economics, Price Fishback. Hello, Professor Fishback. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you, Lipton?
I'm good. You are really energetic.
Well, it's the middle of the day, so we're looking good.
All right. I want to talk to you about redlining. In 2021, you published a piece on redlining. What motivated the research and what is redlining?
So redlining is a situation where people use some kind of feature of somebody as a device for determining whether or not they're going to receive loans. That's typically where they usually talk about it. And so in the early 1900s and even today to some extent or whatever, you see people might use race or ethnicity or religion as a determinant of whether or not someone is worthy of receiving a loan or they're willing to give credit to them and things along those lines. So it's a form of discrimination.
And is redlining always rooted in racism?
No, it can be rooted in ethnicity as well. So, for example, there was redlining probably going on with respect to Hungarian Americans, people who moved here from Hungary, or people from Southern Europe. Definitely Jews faced race redlining as well. So it's usually just something about someone else or whatever, some other group that could cause this kind of thing.
So your paper is titled New Evidence on Redlining by Federal Housing Programs in the 1930s.
Right.
What happened in the 1930s? Why were these programs being implemented?
So what was going on is that there was sorry about that, my throat's getting stuck. So redlining pretty much was a standard practice by a lot of lenders even before you get to the 1930s. So there was a lot of segregation in the United States in where people lived, particularly in cities and stuff. And so there'd be like a black section of town, and there'd be like a Chinese section of town, a Japanese section of town, and things along those lines. And so the reasons that they lived there varied for a variety of different things. I mean, some of it might have been discrimination by different people that they didn't want people moving in. Some of it might be like for a lot of immigrants and even for blacks, whoever who are moving into the city, they like to be in an area where they had neighbors that were like them as well. So that's not redlining. That's just people making decisions to help them decide where to live. A lot of the decisions were being determined by how much income you had and things along those lines as well. And so the redlining could come about, or the discrimination against people in making loans and kind of forcing segregation could have been driven either by just pure like a taste or whatever. You just don't like those kind of people and you don't have them. Another way it could have happened is that people saw that as a signal that these people didn't have as much wealth or things like that, and so they couldn't really afford a loan in a high valued place. And so it's hard to sort out all the various things. But basically, like if you looked at someone moving into a neighborhood in like a high dollar neighborhood, like say in the Beverly Hills in Los Angeles, well, they're going to have a lot of income to begin with. And then they're also going to have the ability, the capacity to repay the loan. So usually the redlining was associated with people talking about getting mortgage loans. Okay. And so the amount of segregation that was going on in the United States increased across cities and across a lot of locations from 1900 all the way into 1930, and then continued on from there. And so what happened is that in the 1930s, the federal government first started getting involved in the real estate markets, and particularly in the lending markets. And so, they had all these houses that were being foreclosed on. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was a government corporation that was created to purchase housing loans from the lender and replace the toxic assets on those books. These loans were all loans that were about to be foreclosed on. They were in really bad shape. And so they bought these loans from the lender, and then they turn around and refinance the loans for the borrower. Okay. And so that was the Homeowner Loan Corporation. And so they did that for about 3 years. And then they stopped the program after about 1 million loans. And so in 1936 was when they made their last loan. And then after that, what they did, the loans were all 15-year loans. And so the HLC lasted until 1951 when the final loans were paid off. Okay, so that was one program. There was another program called the Federal Housing Administration Program, and that had two forms. there was one called Title One. In that one, what they did was they they insured loans up to 20% of loans for helping people rebuild their houses or fix them up and do things along those lines. And then Title Two, what they did was they would insure 100% of the loan for the lender. So the federal government provided the insurance. And so then the borrower is going to get lower interest rates because there was much less problems with repayment of the loan because the federal government had guaranteed the loan. So those were the two federal programs that people have talked about. Now, there are also other programs and all sorts of things at the state and local level. I mean, up until the 1930s, the vast majority of states and local and federal government or wherever discriminated against blacks pretty routinely. They segregated schools. Those segregated schools had lower spending on them and things along those lines per student. How they treated people in terms of crime and the police force, all sorts of things along those lines. So governments were pretty active in discriminating against blacks and also against some of the immigrants as well. And then, so the big question we were trying to address was, did things change in the 1930s? Now, one of the things that happened is that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, what they did was that they made all these loans or whatever, and then they had to figure out, well, how are we going to work with the loans? So they wanted to get a sense of what the markets were looking like in all these cities where they made all these loans. And so at the end of 1935, starting in September of 1935, what they started doing was they did these city surveys where they went around and they asked all sorts of questions. They asked all the lenders what kind of loans they were making. And they did these surveys of lenders. Another thing they did was they went around and talked to real estate agents and they talked to other people, some lenders and stuff, usually about 8 to 10 people who were prominent in town in real estate. And they created these area descriptions. And what they would do is they would describe all sorts of characteristics of the areas. And so they would include like the value of the house, actually for 3 different types of houses in the area, and also rental rents, the typical types of occupations that were located in the neighborhood. And then also one of the things, sadly enough, was they included things like infiltration, which was basically how many blacks were in the neighborhood, what percentage of the population were different immigrant groups like Jews and Italians and things, how many people were on work relief. And so then they created these four grades for the neighborhoods. And so the A grade was for these places like Beverly Hills, where it's really expensive housing. Everybody's really well-to-do and things along those lines. And then there was a B grade, which was not as nice, and then a C grade, and then a D grade. Okay, and so what happened is that the C grade was kind of saying, well, these used to be good neighborhoods, but they're not doing so well now, and things like this. The D grade was areas where that lenders typically found it difficult to make loans, or at least traditional financial firms. Okay, and so the color that they attached to maps for the D grades was red. And so some people believe that redlining came from the fact that they had these red areas on these maps for these Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. Now, it turns out that the FHA was doing something similar, and they actually started earlier than the Homeowners Loan Corporation did in collecting this kind of information. And what they did was they used information from property inventories that had been done actually all the way down to the block level. So, the street you're living on or whatever, go 1 block or wherever, and they could tell you how many people were living there and all sorts of things like this. And so they were doing the same kind of things, except instead of like areas that are bigger, they were using block level information. And that information included things like the value of the house, quality of housing, whether or not you had an indoor toilet or not, things like that. And then they also included a measure that was the percent of the population that was non-white. If the percentage of the population that was non-white was greater than 10%, then they'd identify what was going on. Actually, they just included the percent non-white. Well, in the 1980s, what happened was there was a guy who wrote a book called Crabgrass Frontier, and he discovered the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps in the National Archives. And so he started writing. He says, well, this is probably we think that this is how people were making decisions at the time, and that the redlining comes from these red maps, the red areas on the maps. But the problem is the FHA also was doing things like that, and they had different colors, and they had a lot of red on their maps as well. And actually, after 1936, the HLC is not really active in the housing markets at all because it's made all its loans. They have to worry about they have to worry about some loans not being repaid, and then they have to refinance those. But in general, almost all the federal government activity took place with the Federal Housing Administration insuring loans. Okay. And so, but people didn't pay much attention to that once they saw the HLC maps. And so there were a number of studies that were done that said, look, you look at all these various areas in the maps. And actually there was a group in Virginia that digitized all the maps and put them up on a website. And so there are probably at least 100 papers now, probably more, that look at, well, the maps were this color. The areas that were red were low income areas and also areas where there was a lot of blacks and things like this. Let's look at what those areas look like in the year 2000, year 2010 or 2020. Okay, and see, do you see persistence? Are they areas that are still largely black if they were largely black back then? What's the quality of the housing? Was the quality of housing the same? Is it low quality still, or is it high quality? Has it changed? And so what the study found was that a lot of times, whatever, just these things persisted, right? And so if the neighborhood was in a red district back in the 1930s, oftentimes it would consider to be a low quality neighborhood today or low income neighborhood today and things like that. So this kind of persisted over time. And so then the question is, well, was it the HLC that was actually driving this? And so was it the lending policies of the HLC? And so the people who have studied it have found that the HLC had pretty much finished their activity before they started creating the maps. They still might have used them for a few things, but they finished the activity before they created the maps. And so, and the other thing about it that people hadn't realized was that if you go back and you look in the archives, what you'll find is that the HLC actively kept those maps out of the public eye. So they gave copies of them to the FHA, just a couple of copies to the FHA, but in general, they tried to block people from seeing those maps. And so the only people who could really see them were people inside the government. And so the question then becomes, well, can you blame the HLC? Because the HLC is not showing the maps to anybody. But people were blaming the HLC for this. Okay, and so we got involved in this because we're sitting there thinking, well, the FHA is doing all these things, and they're doing all these things, and they're the ones that are really active in federal policy after 1936. So you should be looking much more carefully at the FHA. And the other thing is we knew, I'd been in the archives and actually been looking at those maps in the early 2000s, and I knew that they were kept like confidential. And so it was kind of hard to see how you could blame the FHA for maps that were being held confidential and not being shown to everybody for the changes that occurred after that. But just sheer persistence would cause you to think. I mean, you think about neighborhoods, like you look at the neighborhoods like you're in the UK, look at the neighborhoods in the UK. There are neighborhoods in the UK and the same neighborhood was bad in the 1930s. It's still bad today, right? You get some gentrification, but a lot of areas, if there was a bad area of town before or a lower income area of town before, low price, house price pound, typically, unless there are big changes, it's typically kind of like that later on as well. And so we were arguing that, well, we think it's really, instead of blaming the HLC, what you really want to think about is this was a snapshot of what real estate agents thought about these neighborhoods in the 1930s. And so these were the kind of things they're saying, look, these are low income areas. We don't think we want to make loans here. We don't think we're worried about getting the loans repaid. And those attitudes were partly driven by discrimination. These people all had, racial attitudes. There was, racism was much worse back then than it is today. And, but you get to see, okay, here's what these guys thought. And so it's a description of what these areas are. And then if there's just persistence, you're going to get the same result. And then what we did was we looked at the FHA much more carefully. And we looked at how they created the maps that they were using and the information that they were doing. And remember, the HLC had areas that might include a whole bunch of streets and things like that, whereas the FHA was actually looking at the block level. They were actually literally looking at each block with these property inventories. And they went in and we found documents that they used to describe how they were going to create maps. And they would create these maps and then on each block, they would write down like these numbers. Okay, and one of the numbers was the percent non-white. All right, and then what they did was they divided the areas up into regions where they thought it was reasonable to loan based on rental values. So they would put a rental value on housing values that the owned housing. So like they'd say, okay, value of this home is $20,000. And so, take that down to what a monthly rent would be, the present value of that would be for a monthly rent. And they'd create a rent for that. Okay, so you have these rental values. And so what they would do is every 10 areas that had a similar average rent, that was an area that they would describe. And any area where there was 4 blocks where you had more than 10% non-white, that was an area. Okay, and so they were explicitly focusing on race, much more so than the HLC in drawing their maps that they were looking at. And you can see in the documents that they write up that they're thinking about this. And you can also see that they have documents where they describe how they evaluate properties. And in some of those, they say, well, there's always been a problem with mixing neighborhoods because property values tend to fall when neighborhoods are mixed. And so that's an issue we need to pay attention to. Now, what's interesting about all this is the following, is that when we analyze the HLC lending, or the HLC refinancing, what we found is the HLC, at least in my view and the view of my co-authors, actually kind of was the reverse of almost every government agency before that time, in that they treated blacks much more equally than any other agency we can find before, even though they have racists and stuff running them and things like this. But what they did is that 5% of the loan, or 4.5% of the loans that HLC refinanced and owned were loans for blacks, for African Americans. Okay. If you look at all the other types of lenders at that time, less than 3% of their loans were blacks. Each type of the other lenders, insurance companies, commercial banks, private lenders, individuals, all sorts of people like that. So they lent much more, or had many more mortgage loans and saved many more mortgage loans for blacks relative to what they did, relative to what lenders were doing for everybody else. Another thing that happened is they charged the same interest rate to blacks. Everybody got charged the same interest rate on the refinance. The features of the refinance were the same. And so they're literally, for one of the first times in American history, a government's actually treating blacks the same way they're treating everybody else. And so when you look at this, actually, they saved a lot of homes for blacks during this time frame. And we're doing it much more. And so when people started blaming the HLC for being the source of segregation today, we started saying, well, you need to look at this a little bit more carefully because, the HLC maps were not being shared with everybody. And so they weren't really a source for people afterwards to really look at. And then, and we can tell a different story about say there were no blacks in this neighborhood. It was a neighborhood that was low valued. It had dirt streets. Hardly very few flush toilets and things like that. That's what it looked like in 1930. Well, I'm betting that in 2020, that neighborhood also looks pretty bad. It may be paved now and things like that, but it's still a low value, low income neighborhood. And so you didn't have to have race at all to have this kind of persistence going on. Now, I'm not saying that race isn't important. It still is. It's an issue that you need to deal with. And it does require, but the HLC turned out to be more like a hero than like the bad guy. So the ones who seem to be bad, the FHA, actually, most of the insurance of the new loans that they looked at were mostly new loans on new housing that were built outside a lot of the cities and suburbs. Okay, and they actually focused on trying to build high quality homes, high valued homes and things like this, which was going to force a lot of people with low incomes not to be able to be eligible to be able to buy the house. Okay, and then they also had this discriminatory policies actually literally written in there in the early 1930s or from 1930 to about 1940. Then they stopped doing that. And they eventually reversed themselves and started try to go the other way in the 1960s. And so another thing we looked at in a paper that came out in 1923 and 24 was, if you were to look at the areas and you were to look at, you run a regression and try to look at, well, how much of the income, how much of the difference in housing value, or how much of the location of people is being driven by what their income looks like, how much is being driven by what the value of the house looks like, and then how much is being driven by race. And so we ran some different estimates and things like that. And the range of estimates that we found were probably about up to somewhere between 80 and 95% were being driven by household income, value of the house, and things along those lines. And somewhere between 5 and 20% was being driven by race and those kind of things. And so we were trying to just get a sense using kind of standard economic techniques of how much could you really assign directly to discrimination and how much could you assign to other types of factors that might have influenced what was going on. And so we think that, so the FHA, they definitely had some issues, and they're really the ones that I would say were being far more discriminatory than the HLC. And the other thing about them is that when they created their maps and they told things, they wrote articles in newspapers and stuff, and in their publicity organs saying, look, if you want to find out what's going on in these neighborhoods and things like that, come see us. We'll show you what we're doing. We'll show you the maps or whatever you can see, what the various values are that are on those blocks, and you can see things like that. They may not have showed them the maps with race and stuff explicitly on there, but they would definitely provide them a lot of information because they were actively lending what was going on. And so we felt like that instead of trying to focus so much on the HLC as the cause of this, that people should have been focusing on all the various problems going on at the local government level. The police not protecting people who moved into a new neighborhood. They actually, literally, some towns actually shifted their segregated school to a different part of town so that Black kids would just tend to congregate around that part of town because that's where the Black school was. And so there was all sorts of stuff that had been going on at the state and local level and at the individual and private level that had been going on for a long time. That is a big factor in determining discrimination as well. And so one of the lessons we thought we were trying to say is that, look, the federal government got involved. HLC seems to be more heroic than they are a villain. And they wouldn't have affected segregation anyway because they were refinancing existing houses. So they weren't in a position where they would change segregation as a result of that. Whereas the FHA could have had a much bigger impact. And they seem to be doing more negative things with respect to Blacks and immigrants and things along those lines. And then you really need to see what's going on with all the people around them and, income levels and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's a pretty long description of what my response to your question.
I was listening to your description. I like long responses. It's a really compelling story. It's always good when an academic knows his research. So sometimes you might be speaking to a scholar, any scholar at all, and the person did a study years ago or maybe recently, but he doesn't remember the details. So it's always good when you're speaking to somebody who remembers the details. So for example, Jeffrey Williamson, who's pretty old, I interviewed him a few years ago, and he really knows his studies. He's really smart.
Oh yeah, no, Jeff's a great guy.
Jeffrey Williamson is really, really smart.
Definitely so. Yeah, Jeff's a great guy. I've known him for a long, long time, ever since I was a graduate student, actually.
Yeah, Robert Solo has taught a number of distinguished students, like Jeffrey Williamson. When it comes to teaching bright students, I put them at the top of the league.
Well, that's good.
Yes. So back to redlining.
Okay.
I read your papers, and I don't know if this matter has been studied, but are there racial differences in redlining that persist today? And by differences, I'm talking about income disparities. So you said that Jews, they were also disadvantaged. So are Jewish neighbors today low quality neighborhoods too?
No, probably not. I mean, so the Jewish population actually, they would tend to be segregated out to some extent, but they also had higher incomes, and so therefore they would be in different districts like C and B or something like that, or maybe some A as well, because they've been very highly successful people. There were black families in all these various places. It's just the odds of being in there were much lower, and so the one of the things about it too was that you have to realize that the number of houses that were in these areas was different as well. So probably about 50 to 60% of the houses in the cities that we studied were in the red areas, were in the low income areas. And then was probably about 20% were in the C and 15% in the B, and then the A's were really, really special neighborhoods. That's where you had swimming pools and movie stars and the rest and things like that. And so what happens is you look at the districts, you look at the red areas in the 9 cities that we studied, blacks accounted for only about 10% of the population or 15% of the population in those areas. The rest were all whites. And so there's a lot of segregation that was going on within the red area that's not being captured by a lot of the studies that have been focused on this. And so I think one of the key things is this persistence story. I mean, if something looks like that back then, everybody could have been exactly the same race and it still might have continued on the same way. And so what we were trying to do was focus in on trying to identify how much was race and how much was all these other things along those lines. And so that's always tricky because race and stuff and ethnicity influence, what kind of education you get a lot of times, what happens when you come to the labor market, what happens when you come to the housing market. A lot of that is determined by your experiences beforehand. And so you might have been discriminated against with segregated schools. And so you're going to walk in and you're going to have this level of schooling that determines what kind of earnings you have. And so race influenced it somewhere, but it just wasn't in the housing market. Once they got to the housing market, the race might not have influenced it nearly as much. But it influenced it like when they were growing up in those kind of different areas.
All right. So price. Is white flight an analytically useful concept?
Oh, I think so. Yeah,
It is.
definitely there have been. Yes, because there are all sorts of documented descriptions of white flight, particularly when they started. I have friends, some of my friends who are involved in the papers with me, like Randy Walsh and Allison Schertzer, Jessica LaVoice. They wrote some papers about blockbusting. So what would happen is that you might find an entrepreneur who's interested in kind of this neighborhood or whatever. And what they would do is they would help blacks move into the neighborhood with the expectations that would drive property values down. And then they'd buy up the housing and then they'd sell it for a higher price to the blacks who are coming in. And so now that's the bad kind of blockbusting. There could be just blockbusting where blacks are moving in and property values fall. This seemed to happen quite often when that happened or when different groups moved in. And so in those kind of settings or whatever, what you see is that the property values start to fall, people decide I'm going to move away. And so that definitely happened in the 1930s. They can document that. Probably happened in the 20s and the teens and the 1900s as well. And then when they had busing in the United States back in the 1970s, you saw a lot of people moving out of urban school districts into the suburbs to try to avoid being bused. And so you can see that. And they're like Boston is a classic example of that. There was a book that was written by Anthony Lucas about the experience called Common Ground that was written in the 1970s about the Boston busing stories and things like that. And white flight was a big part of the story. It's actually a truly great book because he actually went out and interviewed people on all sides of what was going on. And so you got to see within the minds and what everybody was thinking when they were making all their decisions at the time. So that's actually a classic in kind of journalism at the time.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting takes on white flight. There's a new paper arguing that when Asians relocate to a community, that leads to white flight because the Asians do so well academically. So the white people leave because they fear competition.
Well, that could be too. So, the biggest problem worldwide, I think, is just the problem with someone who's different. Like if there's a group that's different, people treat them differently for some reason or wherever. It'd be much nicer if everybody just welcomed them in and said, hello, yeah, let's do all this and stuff. And I think that's actually gotten better over time. I actually think that people have become kind of more sophisticated over time and more welcoming to people from different sections. But that other, or wherever, you can find it everywhere around the world or whatever, you're in Japan or whatever, then there's the gaijin coming in or people from other places. In Europe these days, you have all people coming from the Middle East, and like they've kind of readjusted how their welfare programs work in response and things along those lines. And so it's sad that happens, but it does.
Price, where are you from in the States? Where were you born?
I'm from, I was born in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky. And then I moved around a lot because my dad worked for General Electric, and I ended up going to high school in Kentucky again. And then I started moving around when I I went to graduate school. I went to Butler University in Indianapolis for undergrad, and then I went to graduate school at University of Washington. My first job was at the University of Georgia as a professor, and then I spent a couple of years at University of Texas as a visitor, and then went back to Georgia, and then I moved out to Arizona. So I've been here since 1990.
Okay, 35 years, a long time.
Yeah,
yeah. You seem to be really interested in diversity and meeting different people. So that's why I asked that question. I wanted to ask about your parents. What were your parents like? Were your parents liberal people?
They were pretty much probably I would say they were New Deal Democrats. So I'm more conservative than my parents were. And
but racially, what were they like? Were they pro-black, pro?
Yeah, they actually were very much non-discriminatory.
Okay.
They did not use the N-word and things like that. They thought that was bad. And so they were pretty good. I mean, I don't think they had very many black friends or whatever, just by the nature of where they lived or whatever, but they tried to respect people from all different types of people. So that's where I learned it from.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I asked. They seem,
exactly. Yes. Exactly.
They seem to be quite decent people. Are they still around?
Excuse me?
Are they still alive?
No, unfortunately, no. So I'm getting pretty. I'm not as old as Jeff Williamson, but I'm getting there, and so I've lost my parents by now.
Okay. Yeah. So it's always interesting to speak to people who are around back then. Some people like yourself are racially liberal, but their parents were racist.
Oh yeah, no, that you can see that too. Well, that's the good news is that racist parents don't always mean that you have a racist kid. So, and actually, I just see in the course of my lifetime, I've just seen huge changes in just the way race is discussed and all sorts of stuff. Just really, really major changes. And so it's not perfect. I mean,
when you were growing up as a young man in your 20s and teens, did you know anybody who was a racist?
Oh yeah, because I lived in Florida and I lived in Kentucky. I knew racists when I was teaching at Georgia. And so it just comes in several forms or whatever. And so they're just on some dimensions, whatever they are, but in other dimensions, they're not. It's kind of weird, whatever. So, they say, oh, this guy's it, but they love the music that these people produce.
Okay.
And, so it kind of goes back and forth. People are kind of weird in that way,
Yeah, they are weird indeed. But you're also an expert on the New Deal. So in 2018, you wrote an article in the Review of Business and Economics. I'm always struggling. Okay, essays in economic and business history.
Oh, yes,
yeah. The article on
the newest on the New Deal. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what had happened was that I started into studying the New Deal with a guy named Sean Cantor, who's at the Florida State
But
University.
before you continue, what was the New Deal for people who don't know?
Oh yeah, the New Deal. So basically, what's going on in the New Deal is that in the starting in 1929 or soon thereafter, we had a Great Depression in the United States, and so we had all sorts of problems. Actually, people don't realize that President Hoover and the Congress actually spent quite a bit of money during the early 1930s, but they couldn't turn it around. So Hoover lost to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1932 election. And then when Roosevelt came in, he started what he called the New Deal. And what they did was they had just a whole wide range of new federal programs that did all sorts of things the federal government had never done before. And they spent a very large amount of money trying to reverse the situation in the economy. And so the way I got involved in studying the New Deal was Sean, who was my co-author on a bunch of papers and a book about workers' compensation. He was wandering around in the library and found these sheets of paper that showed how much they spent on like 30 different programs in each county in America. So all of a sudden you had this opportunity to look at how much they spent at the local level in all these places. And so we started studying the New Deal probably in 1998 or so. And then we've been writing a whole bunch of papers about it. And we've had a whole bunch of students and co-authors and all sorts of things.
What was the FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration?
Yeah, so the Federal Emergency Relief Administration was kind of the first attempt at actually providing relief spending. And so what the FERA did was that they actually provided direct payments for relief. They kind of took over relief from a lot of local places and started paying people directly if they were in trouble. And then they also created work relief projects where they'd hire people to work kind of for not necessarily great wages. The wages were about 2/3 of a normal wage and things like that. But they were just trying to provide them with income and also provide them with meaningful work. And so that lasted for about 2 years. And then it kind of phased out for about another year and a half. And that was replaced by the Works Progress Administration. And the Works Progress Administration was completely focused on work relief. And so paying people to work on various public works projects and stuff. And so they also were paying like about half to 2/3 of a regular wage when they were doing that. But, they hired a lot of people. They built a lot of public works. Every county in America, almost every town, you can find stuff that was built during the 1930s with these programs. And then another thing the federal government started doing in 1935 was that they also started, they actually kind of gave relief back to state and local governments to use for them to fund it. But they also built up programs for aid to dependent children and old age assistance and aid to the blind that kind of built on prior state programs and expanded them. So they provided matching grants that really expanded the welfare system quite a bit. And then they had all sorts of programs for all sorts of different things. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. Some of them were negative.
I read your paper, and in it you note that you don't describe the New Deal as racist. So in the revisionist literature, the New Deal is being painted in a negative light. But in your paper, you argue that in some parts of the South, the programs of the New Deal were more likely to benefit Black Americans.
Yeah, that's well, it depends on what you're linked. A lot of things was based on what was going on at the local level. So one thing about the New Deal is that they would state in their national statements, like they'd have reports, right, from the WPA, or they have reports from some agency that said, we are not going to discriminate. Okay. And that's what they would say in the report. But, it's a big country. And so they've got to hire a bunch of people to actually run these programs. And typically what they would do is they would hire locals to run the programs. And so the local, even though the federal government says it's not going to discriminate, the local person could still discriminate in all sorts of ways that you wouldn't necessarily catch. And so we have another paper that you and I emailed about that's not quite ready for prime time yet.
Yes.
Where what we were suggesting is that the federal program said no discrimination, but that there was discrimination at the local level. the main results, these results will hold up no matter what happens. But in that, the main results from that paper were that outside the South, it turns out that if you control for whether someone owned their own house and what their income or how many kids they had and their education and a variety of other things. Outside the South, then blacks seem to have equal or sometimes even better access to work relief than whites. Okay, but inside the South, that was true for about 30% of the counties. And then in about 70% of the southern counties, wherever, then blacks seem to have less access to work relief than whites did. Now, that doesn't tell you about how they were paid on work relief and what kind of jobs they got on the work relief. So it's not a complete story about what happened on those places. And there's some evidence that there were differential pay and different access to jobs, to better paying jobs within work relief. But most of the jobs in work relief were low-skilled labor, and so there wasn't that much range in terms of the kind of wages that were being paid. So part of the idea for looking at this was I've been studying the New Deal, like I said, since 1998. A lot of times we didn't have information on who was black, who was white, or who was immigrants. So once we got access to the universal censuses, like the full census of 1930 and 1940, we can do a lot more about what's happening for different people, different type of people. And so that opened the door for us to start doing things about what happened for immigrants and what happened for blacks. But a lot of times what we're really just trying to look at was like multipliers. Like, if you spent money in the state, how much you spend $1 in the state, how much did state income go up? And so what we found in a lot of those studies was that you spent an extra $1 in the state and the income in the state went up by $1, but it didn't have this big multiplier effect that they often claim would be there. So it passed through, so it was good because you spend $1 and the income goes up by $1, so that's good news. But it wasn't spend $1 and you get $3 back. In the United States, they always have these stadium proposals where they're going to build this brand new stadium for a huge amount of money. They're going to spend a lot of tax dollars and stuff, and they say, "Oh yeah, we'll get $3 for every $1 we spend." Mm-hmm. Well, and then the economists come in and they actually do a study, and for these stadiums or whatever, they get 10 cents for every $1 that they spend instead. And so you're actually crowding out a bunch of other kind of activity. So spend this $1, crowd out 90 cents of other activity, and get 10 cents of gain for stadiums during this time period. Not during this time, during the modern period.
The New Deal was a technocratic job program in America. In developing countries, these are what we refer to as what Jamaicans would call bolo work. So
what kind of work?
Bolo work is a Jamaican term for low quality government job programs where sometimes people are contracted to do a job but they don't show up and it's really patchy, but the New Deal was more scientific.
Yeah, the New Deal was more, because they've been, the progressive era in the United States, like in the 1890s up to the 1920s, they had spent a lot of time trying to professionalize what was going on inside governments and stuff. And the New Deal picked up on that. I mean, they hired a lot of people who were local people who had already been working in relief work and social work and things like that. But believe me, they still had a lot of problems. So it wasn't quite that bad. And, the relief jobs, a lot of them were like digging ditches and, building roads and things like that. So that was hard work. I mean, those people who got the work relief jobs were working really, really, really hard.
But do those programs really improve the economy? Lee Ohanian, said that the New Deal delayed economic recovery by 7 years.
Yeah, but actually Lee's talking about a different program, actually. So I've had talks with him about this. So like I said, there were some programs that were successful. And I think that the work relief and the public works programs where they built new public works and things like that actually were generally reasonably successful. This is where you got the dollar for dollar kind of thing. So that you actually got, improved public works, improved roads, improved sanitation, things like that. Now, what the program that Lee was really focused on in the paper that he wrote with Hal, oh God, I'm blanking on Hal's last name. Anyway, Cole Nohanian, Hal Cole. So they were looking at the program known as the National Recovery Administration. And the National Recovery Administration actually was actually much more of a regulatory program than it was a spending program. The spending programs, except for the agricultural programs, actually work pretty well. So when Lee and Hal were talking about the National Recovery Administration, what they were saying is that what happened with the NRA is that they set up these things, what they called codes of fair competition, in all these industries. And so the goal was to bring consumers and workers and the employers together and set up codes of competition in each industry that all these three groups agreed to. But typically what happened was that the employers kind of dominated a lot of what was going on. And so, but what they would do is they would try to set prices, and they would try to set wages, and they would try to set hours per week, and do a variety of things to try to help recover. And so what you find is that typically what happened is almost like a government-sponsored cartel in some ways. And so what happens is that they raise prices and reduce output like a typical monopoly cartel would. And so that's kind of what Lee and those guys were talking about. Another thing that they did was that on the labor side, I have another paper that's just come out in the Review of Economics and Statistics with Nick Zebarth and Chris Vickers. And we did this study where we were looking at a lot of people. Lee had said that they were kind of keep high wages, and that led to high unemployment. But actually, part of this program, the situation was that they actually were trying to run a job sharing program to some extent. We found all sorts of documentation about this in the reports for the National Recovery Administration, industry by industry. And so they actually literally went in and said, look, we want you to reduce the number of hours per week. And so that you can actually increase employment and everybody works just fewer hours. But if you've got fewer hours, whatever you need, you can't cut wages. You got to leave wages at least where they were, maybe even raise them some, because otherwise their weekly wage is going to drop substantially. And so on the labor market side or whatever, they were kind of making it, they reduced the number of hours worked per week. Wages stayed roughly the same, maybe went up a little bit in nominal terms. But employment actually fell. The number of people employed fell. The number of people employed rose, but not as much to offset the loss in hours. And so the situation was kind of like this kind of weird situation where the federal government is kind of putting all these limits on how everything works. So you get lower work weeks, fewer hours worked, slightly higher wages per hour. Your weekly wage probably went down a little bit, and then they were charging higher prices, and we have a lot of people working quite as much, and so output's down, and so that's what Lee was talking about. And so they built a dynamic structural model to say, okay, well, if you do these things, here's what's going to happen. But they did not focus on the hours per week. They focused on other things.
So why were the infrastructural programs successful?
Well, I think part of it is that some of it was they were building infrastructure that the areas needed. I mean, so that, they're probably building infrastructure that would have been built anyway if it had been a very robust economy. So instead, what they were doing is they were building this thing to actually try to get the economy to come back to where they wanted it to be. And so they were building sanitation works and things like this, and they were doing public health type stuff. And so one of the papers I wrote with Sean Cantor and Mike Haynes, we did a study of like 114 cities, and we looked at things like infant mortality and mortality from a variety of different things. And it turned out that the relief spending in those cities actually was very, very, very helpful in reducing infant mortality and suicides and deaths from diarrheal disease, which sounds like just a horrible way to go, and several other types of things. So one of the most powerful effects that these relief programs had in the 30s was to actually reduce mortality during a period where mortality was starting to rise. It also helped fertility rates recover, so birth rates actually started to recover faster. Because a lot of the mortality problems were in the lower part of the income distribution, and so when you're providing relief, you're actually providing a lot of help to people who were, not getting enough food sometimes and not getting enough shelter and things. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it was successful. I think the National Recovery Administration was less successful, and actually they struck it down, saying it was unconstitutional in 1935, and that was probably the best thing they could have done because they were basically violating antitrust laws. All the antitrust laws that you usually see, they were just saying, okay, we're not going to enforce those laws. And so they were doing the reverse of what you'd want to do in terms of antitrust. And so that's what Lee and Hal were trying to do. Now, there's some other people who disagree with them, but the guy named Galty Egerton wrote some papers where he thought that it went the other way. But we should talk about that in another one.
All right. What about minimum wage laws during the New Deal era?
So what happened was, when you look into what was going on, they did not have a number of states between 1910 and 1923 passed minimum wage laws, probably about 20 states, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then in 1923, the Supreme Court announced that those minimum wage laws were unconstitutional. And so states still, the states that had them on the books, they kind of tried to enforce them anyway, but just kind of through the back door. Like the way that Massachusetts tried to enforce it was that if someone paid a wage that was lower than the minimum that they recommended, then they would publish their name in a newspaper and say that this person's paying less than the minimum wage. And then what happens is in the mid 1930s, after the Supreme Court strikes down the National Recovery Administration, they actually strike down another state minimum wage law in 1936. And in 1937, they actually reverse course. They change course, and they actually say it's constitutional. And so they passed the federal minimum wage law in 1938. So it's a complicated story. I actually have a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives with Andy Seltzer, he's in Europe. He's at let's see, which one is it? He's in London, actually. I can't remember the school. But anyway, so Andy had written a bunch of stuff with the minimum wage, and but it's really interesting because state governments actually were driving everything until finally the federal government decided it was constitutional, and then they switched. So that started in 1938.
I'm wondering when you were when you were going to mention this paper. How successful was the New Deal? The macroeconomic impact of New Deal spending and lending policies in the 1930s.
Which one's that one again? It's what journal was it in?
I just read your Edinburgh papers. So I don't remember the name of the journal.
Okay, it was a microeconomics study.
Okay, let me
just reread the title.
How successful was the New Deal? The macroeconomic impact of New Deal spending and lending policies in the 1930s. Yes.
Yeah, that appeared in the Journal of Economic Literature. So the idea behind that paper was to actually summarize a lot of the other papers in one place.
Oh.
So a lot of the stuff I've been talking about is actually talked about in there because it's a summary of what's going on. Now, the redlining stuff came after that. So all the stuff we've been doing about race and ethnicity and stuff came after that 2015, 16 paper or something like that. Maybe, I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but yeah, so that's kind of a lot of the things we've been talking about appear in that paper is just kind of summarizing what happened.
And you mentioned the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Yes, we didn't talk about the financial aspect of the New Deal.
Oh, so the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a program created in the Hoover administration, actually. So it was created in February of 1932. And what Hoover was trying to do with that, a they actually were just a lending agency that was out there lending to all sorts of people. They lent to commercial banks and tried to backstop commercial banks quite a bit. They also they lent before the federal government got involved in trying to provide grants for relief. The RFC made loans to local governments to try to provide relief. And they actually, the RFC was kind of like, whenever they wanted to start a new program and things like that, they kind of would use funds from the RFC to kind of help it get off the ground. And then the RFC lasted all the way through World War II as well. So they used the RFC as kind of a way to make all sorts of different kinds of loans. So the RFC made loans to railroads and manufacturers and building and loans and all sorts of different kinds of people. So they were kind of all over the place. They were kind of one of your, kind of a utility infielder, if you know anything about baseball. Or they were around where they were, they kind of did just about everything, a jack of all trades.
What would have happened if America didn't pursue the New Deal?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually think, so there are disagreements about what's going on. Remember that it kind of depends on which programs you're talking about. I think if you look overall, by the time we get to the end of 1941, just when U.S. starts to enter the war in World War II, we're pretty much back on our long-run growth path. So we've gone through just this huge hole. I mean, real GDP was 30% lower in 1932, whether it was in 1929. It was 30% lower in 1933. And, so you had this huge trough and then we came back. So I think the New Deal did help the recovery and try to get back there. Part of the boom that occurred in 1940 and 41 with Lend-Lease and things like that before we entered the war. That soaked up some of the unemployment as well. But by the time you get to December of 1941, we're pretty much back on where you would expect us to be if we hadn't ever faced the Great Depression. So, when you get the dollar for dollar effects that I'm talking about with the public works and relief, the public works and relief accounted for about 80 to 85% of the money that they spent, direct spending, grant spending, around the country during that time frame. So you're getting a pretty strong boost from that. National Recovery Administration actually thinks slowed things down. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, they actually paid farmers to take land out of production. So they created as many problems as they solved and maybe created even more. So they actually created unemployment when they hurt. Definitely they hurt low income sharecroppers and tenants and farm workers. And caused a lot of unemployment in the farm sector. So different programs did some, like the public works and relief stuff, I think were relatively successful. The Homeowners Loan Corporation they actually stimulated the housing market. But the NRA and the AAA, actually, I'm not a real fan of.
Interestingly, I didn't intend to talk about this issue, but there's a book, Economic History of Warfare and State Formation, and you have an article in that book. So when you mentioned war, I remember
Oh yeah,
remembered the article.
Oh yeah. So you've been reading really widely. I mean, you've seen all these things.
Yeah, I read. I'm a big fan of the Great Divergence. So I saw the article by Tirthankar Roy and his co-authors,
Uh-huh.
and I downloaded the book. So there's an article by Mark Harrison, Myths of the Great War, and then there's yours, World War II and U.S. Economic Performance.
Yeah. So so that was a paper I wrote with Taylor Jaworski. I'd written an earlier paper with Joe Cullen that appeared in the Economic History Review. The English Economic History.
Yes, I know it.
And so one of the things we found is that they spent a huge amount of money fighting the war, and we were trying to look at the local impact of what was happening. You go in, you spend a huge amount of money. They totally changed the economy over, or not totally, but half changed the economy over to a wartime footing. So they're not producing normal goods and services. They're producing stuff you're going to go blow up somewhere. And so what Joe and I were doing, and initially the thought experiment was the following. Here you are in 1939, you're coming out of the Depression, and you're in a county where they spent a whole bunch of money producing wartime goods, World War II goods. And then in 1946 or whatever, they stop, and then they, it kind of goes back to what the old situation was, or, whatever was going on. You just go to the new situation, right? So what do you look like in 1950? Do you have a big increase in per capita income? Do you have a lot more people than you did before? Things like that. That's what the questions we were asking. And so what we found was you get this big surge of spending and stuff in certain places. And in those places, you get a big migration. You get a lot of people moving in, a lot of change, like the number of people moving in. But the per capita stuff, like per capita measures of income or retail sales and consumption and things like that, don't change very much, which actually was a stunner to us. We thought you were going to get a pretty substantial effect. So mostly it just kind of rearranged where people lived in the country without really changing per capita incomes that much. And then Taylor's got a couple other papers, or Taylor Jaworski and I wrote the paper that you're talking about.
Yes.
That appeared in this, that paper actually is in a book honoring Mark Harrison, actually.
Yes, the book.
Yeah,
yes,
and Mark, Mark is he's just an amazing guy. You should talk to him because he has all sorts of stuff about the Soviet Union and also about war and things like that. But then what Taylor did was that Joe and I had stopped looking in about 1955 or 1957. And so what Taylor said, well, let's take this and let's go all the way to the year 2000 and see what kind of effect it had. And so we pretty much found the same thing. And Taylor put it on we built a much more sophisticated model for doing things in this case or whatever. And so that was because of Taylor. But what we found was pretty much the same story. I mean, you still had the migration effect, but you really didn't get that big a change in the per capita stuff. And so, at least at the local level, World War II didn't change things much. And the Bob Higgs, who was my thesis advisor, and I and some other people have been writing about how costly the war was to America. People talk about, well, you're producing all this stuff, but we're producing stuff we don't normally produce, and we're spending it on the war, right? So we're fighting the war with it. So pretty much World War II looks like big GDP numbers, but actually it's kind of like a sacrifice because what you're able to consume is going down rather than going up because you can't get certain foods and you can't get new cars and you can't get new houses or anything like that. And the U.S. was lucky because they didn't fight anything on our soil or wherever, but you look at the rest of the world, you look at England, for example, and they lost a lot more because of all the destruction from the bombing. And then you look at the Soviet Union, and I think we figured out. I figured out for one thing that Soviet Union lost about 13 years of GDP fighting World War II, and Germany lost about 8.
Wars are not beneficial.
Definitely not. That's one of the big messages.
No, there's the argument that war makes the state. I think that argument is now being disrupted. War depletes capital formation, but the fiscal military state in Europe, that enabled growth. But other than that specific example, the fiscal military state.
But that's back in 1600.
Exactly.
1800. And then that's a questionable story because then you have to figure out, well, how much human capital did you lose? And did the situation really get better because you had a bigger state? Hard to say. And I've got friends who are really smart guys like Phil Hoffman and a number of people.
And Patrick O'Brien.
Yep, exactly.
He's the pioneer in this arena, the fiscal military state. But beyond his articles, wars are not good for growth.
Yeah. That's right. And so, matter of fact, there's if you grew up in the 60s, this song "War" by Edwin Starr in Motown or whatever. So, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Yes. Say it again.
Yes. But thanks for coming on. We're wrapping up. I think that the economic profession is experiencing a revolution. I like the research that's being churned out. My only problem is that economists do have an impact on public discourse and popular culture, But these days, there are few young economists, I think economists in their 40s, 30s, and early 50s, who are contentious. I like controversial economists. Yes, we don't make economists like Carlos Cipolla
Oh,
anymore
well, that's true. Yeah,
and
no,
David
Carlos was
Landis.
an
Exactly.
amazing
We
man
don't.
too.
Yeah. What did you say?
Carlos was an amazing man too. So
Exactly. We
yeah.
don't make those type of aggressive
Well,
economists anymore.
what's happened in the profession in general and stuff has been really trying to focus in on causality in such a way that you can tightly say that this was a causal factor. But that kind of really focuses you in on just one thing when there's so many other things going on. And so you may be able to tell that one story, but then the question is, well, how does that fit in with the rest of it? And that's where people like, well, Chipola, he was much broader than I am.
Yeah.
And Jeff Williamson just studied the world and things like that. I mostly study America.
Yeah, repeat Rush's last name. Repeat the second person's name again. Let me hear
Jeff
it.
Williamson.
No, not Jeffrey. Rush Propos.
Oh, Carlos Chipola.
No, you call Cipolla. Yes. You call him Rush. You call him Rush.
Yeah. Those guys. They were thinking big.
Yeah.
But they weren't trying to really nail down they say it was causal, but you didn't know. And so they were, the people today are focusing on nailing down that causality. And I think they're missing some of the bigger picture as a result.
Yeah. Like as I said, the quality of the research is really good. But another issue I have with the papers that are written in economics today is that they're not confident. So when you read a Jeffrey Williamson's paper, you know what he's talking about. These papers have so many omissions and political correctness. They're hard to follow.
Well, I will say this. I know a lot of guys who are doing the kind of research we're talking about, or whatever. They're very confident.
Yeah.
But they're confident about that they've really isolated the causality and stuff.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people out there you can find. Well, look at Ajimolu and Robinson.
Yes. I agree.
They're willing to write big stuff.
Yeah. That's it. They do write big stuff. There's a revolution, but as I said, the people with the energy like Cipolla and Williams and Landis, those aggressive economists and North and Friedman, we don't make those people anymore.
Yeah. Well, Milton Friedman was kind of pretty amazing on his own.
Yeah.
So, a lot of amazing folks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on. This is really a pleasure.
All right.
So it's great to talk to someone who actually reads all this stuff. So
I should get a PhD in Fishback studies.
Exactly. And so I feel so good wherever So when you're a rare book author, rare article author, you having people discover it is actually pretty exciting.
Yes. But I've interviewed a lot of economists if you follow the channel.
Oh yeah. I know you told me that. I was really impressed.
I interviewed David Eltis some weeks ago.
Oh yeah, he's done some great work on slavery.
David Eltis has a new book called Atlantic Cataclysms.
Oh really? Oh, I got to check that out.
It's really good. It's really good.
That sounds
good.
good.
I've read it and it's really good. A lot of new information.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right. So see you. Bye.
Great to talk to you.
Yeah.